what we're starting off with here is a 1/2 inch hole, and we're going to drive our tapered reamer into here. Excuse the noise, that's the sound of my 3-phase generator in the background. Alright, now we're going to double check everything and make sure it fits properly. I spent some time and I did some machining and welding on our adapter plate. This is for our tie rods. Like I said before, I wanted to machine it and put 3 holes in it so that I had it fixed down with some bolts. Probably the hardest part about machining this piece was this here. This is a taper all the way through. I'm not sure if you can really see that in the camera or not. So what I did was I took the bar and I machined all the holes in it that I needed. And when it came time to machine the tapers in the 3/4 inch piece here, I machined the taper into it. And then I put my my tie rod into it, and realized that I had quite a bit of room that I needed to make a spacer for, so that I could hold it down with the nut on it. And so I ended up needing this other little 1/2 inch piece here. So what I did is I took some 3/4 inch tubing that was 1/2 inch diameter, and I ran my tapered reamer through it so that it matched up with the side there. A little bit of measuring going on there, but not a big deal. And then I had an extra tie rod that I just bolted it through and held it down, then TIG welded these in place. So I did that for both sides. And I also TIG welded this plate as well in place and use the bolts. And then if we have any trouble, we've also got the bolts. Now I ran into some issues. I didn't have any 5/16 nuts other than this one here, which was a lock nut, and I ended up melting the plastic out of it. But sometimes you got to do what you got to do. Now the other thing that I'm working on right now, because I have good access to the master cylinder in this car, is we're doing a disc brake conversion. And this is only a single master cylinder, so it's a little bit scary. And I've had a couple situations where I couldn't stop that well and realized that my brakes were bad. And part of it was this master cylinder here. So when you take the pedals out of this car, you can see the serrations on here. The pedals can't actually be removed from the car except from the inside. So there's bolts that go through here that hold these serrations in place on the pedals. And these pins hold it in place. Now on these pins, there's a groove here. And you can see this here. If you remove that, there's a pin that goes through there. So you have to remove this and get that pin out to remove these. Now these are riveted on from the factory. And so I didn't realize at first that there was a pin in here, and ended up removing it. I broke that pin. It was hardened steel. This is all that's left of it now. And so what I'm going to have to do is TIG weld these back on. And it might have been a good thing anyway, because on this new one that we have, now this is a early 60s Mustang master cylinder and a conversion kit that I bought from Chevs of the 40s. And so When these go back in, this allows me to use my clutch pedal still. When this goes in, this side will be retaining that side of the pin from coming out. But you also need something to retain this. So this will go flat against here to retain that once it's tightened. Then that way we'll have good control over that. And obviously, we've got an adjustable Heim joint down here. And this bolts right back into the stock position underneath the floor. Now I'm probably going to have to open up the floor a little bit because the access was only so that you could reach this plug in the old master cylinder, which isn't a big deal. I'll mark it out, pull the carpet, cut it out with the air saw, and probably put a little access door on there. Not a big deal, but that's what we're working on for now, and we'll get things going. Well, I've got quite the mess going on right now in the shop, and we're starting to make some headway in our lower column support. So the first thing that I did is I took a piece of cardboard and I tried to make a shape that would flow with the firewall, so we had enough space that we could drill this out, put some bolts. So I'm going to put button head screws in here, go with 3, so that it looks nice and it doesn't really need a lot of support. I mean, it is holding the column, but we don't need, it's not like a suspension bracket where we need a lot of support. So this is basically the shape that was in there. So there's a teardrop shape through the firewall that's just like this because of the old 3-speed transmission with the shifter linkage coming through the firewall. And down in the bottom is where the column comes through. So you'll notice that this is an oval shape, and that's because the column comes through at about a 60 degree in the bottom, 120 in the top. And then what this does is it allows it to come in at an angle. And so what we're going to do is we're going to cut this out of steel, and I don't have big enough steel that I can make this in one piece, unfortunately. So I'll cut it down the middle, weld the tube halves together, make sure that they're flat as I weld them. I made a lower column support. Now this is 2-inch exhaust tubing, and this here I split it, and then I just took 2 pieces of angle iron and drilled them so it holds it together. Now this is tightened up here that it actually clamps onto the column and holds it fairly stiff. Now this is our 1 3/4 piping right here, and it slides through. But if I try to push it through, I can't because I've got that tight. Now what will happen here is I'll open this up a little bit and I'll slide this through the hole. As you can see, we'll have enough room on here that the column can come through, and I'll tack weld this in a couple of spots just to make sure it's going to be correct. Draw some scribe lines on there, and once I have this where I feel it's in a good spot for the firewall and I mark it around, then I'll weld it all the way in. Now what I'm trying to achieve with this is in the back, I'm trying to have it so that it holds it fairly steady. We'll have bolts that go through the firewall, and I'll just use some big washers in the back here after it's welded through. And then this clamp will squeeze the bottom of the column to hold it through. So when we wanted to do a rack conversion, we decided that we wanted to keep the stock column just because we thought that it suited the era and the style of the car that we were trying to do. So I had to cut where the original 3-speed selector piece was. So I cut this right out of the steering box. The steering box sits like this against the frame, and I cut right through it. You can see the 3/4 inch shaft coming through it right here. Now I cut that and removed that, and I was left with this. And to remove this, I used a combination of an exhaust tubing cutter, and I was able to turn this inside the car using a pipe wrench on the bottom of it, and it didn't even really leave any marks on it at all. So once I was able to score it most of the way around, what I couldn't cut with the exhaust tubing cutters, I cut with the body saw, and it was a lot of work, but I feel like it was worth doing it this way. So now to adapt this so that we have like a modern style steering column, you can see my selection of exhaust tubing here. I went down to the local auto store and picked a bunch of this up, and I had a couple of bearings in mind. So this is going to be our column support bearing, and I found a piece of pipe or exhaust tubing that slides into here, and I'll give it some real good tacks once it's inside the car. So what we're going to do is, because this is tapered, this bearing fits down in here. So we'll take and measure from the bottom to the front, mark it out on here, and we'll use our exhaust tubing cutter so that this sits flush with the end. And we'll use a 3/4 inch shaft stop here to retain that. So now we'll have retaining both ways on the column, because we'll have our upper bushing on the column and then the lower bushing or lower bearing on here. So when we cut the shaft, we cut right through it with the zip cut, and we cut it off here. So now we've got a lot of excess, and to reach our steering box we're going to have to put in a double universal joint. Now to keep that from being sloppy, I bought a 3/4 inch Heim joint, and we're going to use this and make a holder where the old steering box used to be to support that shaft. So this is what I was talking about with the teardrop shape going onto the firewall. Now I need to just drill 3 holes on this, and then install this and drill the holes into the firewall where I want this to sit. It turned out pretty good. It didn't really warp that bad. You can see there's a bit of a warp on there, but once I tighten this back up onto the firewall, it's going to pull that nice and flat. I tried really hard to make some nice looking welds on here because I just want to dress these up a little bit, and I just skip welded this with the MIG, kind of went a little bit hard on it, but this is also 1/8 steel, and this is just exhaust tubing on here. So what I just tried to do was to mostly fill in the gap that was left there. You can see back here I had to dress it up a little bit to get my angle, and I ended up having to fill this because I dressed it up a little bit too much. So I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. There is stuff commercially available for doing this, but I wanted to spend the time to try and make something that looked a little bit more custom, and there's a couple of holes in the firewall that I wanted to go and try and fill with this plate, and I felt the best option, rather than installing a bottom piece and then trying to make a cover for the firewall or having a piece of rubber that covers it, would be just cover everything entirely with one piece that's going to look okay. Now I think I'm going to paint this white like the rest of the firewall and install it, and so we'll get this installed, and then we'll get our lower bearing support installed on the 3/4 inch shaft that's coming through.